Welcome to the State of the Nation Business, brought to you by Korean Capital. And joining us today, very excited to speak to him, and that is Simon de Plooy. He is the head of asset allocation at Korean Capital. He follows the stuff, and it's not just like he's analyzing it. To him, it's important. His own performance depends on the accuracy of this data and this kind of analysis. So this guy has got some skin in the game. Simon, welcome to the State of the Nation Business. Good to speak to you.
Mike, thank you so much for that generous welcome. And yes, some skin in the game, but yeah, it's ultimately our clients' money. So we try and look out after the best interest of our clients.
You're right. Now, it sometimes can be a little bit more pressurizing than when it's your own. Now, Simon, the big news over the last while has been the letter, the dreaded letter that we finally got from the US, from courtesy of President Donald John Trump, and that was to say that he's slapping on a 30% tariff on all South African imports, to America, or exports to America, one should say, all the imports that they get from us. And it may not be massive in the scheme of US trade, because that economy is gigantic, but it's very important for South Africa. Tell us, what are the implications of those tariffs?
Mike, as far as we can establish is that certain industries has been exempted. Most importantly, the mines and minerals. So, some of our critical metals that we export have been exempted. Similarly, some key industries are not exempted. I believe autos and our fruit exports are probably most at risk. And I think that the ultimate effect on this still has to be seen. We've seen the Trump administration, change their mind during their negotiations. Deadline was given, then it was extended. Now we've got a 1st August deadline for many countries globally. So it's very clear the Trump administration uses the tariffs as a negotiating tool, and while it does appear there will be some level of tariffs on essentially all countries, I think it remains to be seen what the final impacts are. However, worryingly, I think for certain industries that have got large exports to the US, is that it doesn't look they'll be able to avoid tariffs, unfortunately.
Yeah, and obviously in South African context, we like some of the exports that we send to America, because these are beneficiated goods that we're sending. This is stuff, it's not, minerals, you dig it out of the ground, you clean it up, you send it off. But when you sort of involved in the vehicle trade, there's many hands that lead to that vehicle. The same goes with a bottle of wine. It's not just digging something out of the ground and heating it up and cooling it down. In this case, it's quite a labor-intensive process, and in South Africa, it accounts for quite a few jobs, doesn't it?
I think any industry that's affected, it's people's lives and livelihoods that are at stake. I think minerals is a very key export for South Africa, and it's very critical to our economy. But just because it's relevant for the whole country, people man in the street on individual industries still get affected. It's no solace if to say, well, the country will be fine, or some imported industry will be fine, but your industry is not. So I think we shouldn't skim over that. However, I do think we need to take a broader picture view here. I think if we look at, I think we did a slide there that shows that, the tariffs that's at least tentatively put on not only on South Africa, but some other countries as well. And you can see that, for example, in the case of Brazil, they've now been hit with a 50% tariff. Now, what's fascinating about that is Brazil actually sits with a trade deficit with the US. The US exports more to Brazil than Brazil exports to the US. And one of the rationale for the tariffs was that the US sits with trade deficits, which the Trump administration believes is not in their best interest. Now, why is this important? Well, ultimately, the tariffs becomes a relative game. If your country is slapped with a 30% tariff, but one of your competitors that also export to the US is struck with a much higher tariff, like 50%. Ultimately, your goods become comparatively more competitive, metals from South Africa will be cheaper than metals from Brazil, based on just the tariff alone, by nearly 20% in terms of percentage points. And meaning we actually become a preferred supplier in a price sense, in some industries. And it also tells us that there's something more afoot in terms of the US tariffs, that it's not only about a trade deficit. There is something more that's going on here. So I think as much as we should be concerned, we shouldn't be too quick to reach conclusions here, and we must see how it plays out, not only for our country, but how it affects all countries across the globe, because this trade is ultimately a competitive game between a lot of countries.
Yeah, and you mentioned Brazil, and quite understandably, sort of 20% of their 50% seems to be almost sort of political in nature. They gave them an extra bit because he didn't like the transfer of power, or the court case against Bolsonaro, who was the former Brazilian president. And there's this threat of an extra 10% even to South Africa for any of these BRICS countries that are looking for alternatives to US dollar hegemony. Means that these tariffs are there's maybe a business case for tariffs because many countries charge them, but some of it is purely almost punishment, isn't it? And it's kind of difficult to run an economy when you've got this kind of uncertainty with one of your major trading partners.
I think you're absolutely right, Mike. It's clear that it's not only about trade deficits. You're right that I think many businesses find it very difficult, or will find it very difficult, to operate in this environment, because a business ultimately needs certainty. If you know you're sitting with a 50% tariff, then at least you can plan for that, and you can make the appropriate changes to make sure your business survives. However, if the tariff is constantly changing, it becomes very difficult to make any sort of long-term plan. But similarly, I think this speaks to the predicament that the US finds themselves in. The US is a massively indebted country, along with most major economies in the world. I think we've got a slide here that clearly shows that the large countries that we think is the stable countries, the United States, France, United Kingdom, all have Canada have much higher debt levels than the emerging markets. So they really sit with a big debt problem, and the US in particular is such a big problem because they still run what we in the economics call a primary deficit. Now, what it really just means is that when they're trying to balance their budget, they're not bringing even in enough revenue to service their debt, meaning to pay the interest on their debt. It says that they actually have to borrow money just to pay the interest on their debt. So the recent bill that, the one big beautiful bill, as Donald Trump decides to name it, has put up the deficit to such an extent that they really don't have another choice but to indirectly tax their citizens. Now, a tariff is ultimately a tax on your own citizens. It affects everyone. It affects the countries that export to the US, including South Africa. But it ultimately comes down to a tax on a US citizen. And it looks like, at least, from our perspective, that one thing that is playing here is that the Trump administration is trying to play a game where he is, showing very hard stance against foreign countries, but ultimately is imposing a tax on the American consumer. And in that sense, trying to raise revenue for the American fiscus so they can actually get their debt under control without actually cutting their spending.
Yeah, because you've dealt with this issue of why they're imposing the tariffs, and we see that the US debt. Could that also be the reason why these things will lead to a weakening of the dollar? Does that help what Donald Trump is out to get?
So it definitely plays a role. So, when you no longer perceive a country as a safe haven destination where you can comfortably go and park your cash. So, let's just take the dollar for a moment. The dollar forever and a day has been, your safe haven asset. If there's any kind of turmoil in the world, you go and buy dollars, and the dollar would actually appreciate in value, at least in the short term. If you want to take the most secure credit historically, you would place your deposit in a dollar bank account. In fact, very few, not a lot of dollars can live outside of the American banking system, to the extent that you've got banks in Europe being able to hold and trade dollars because it's such a valuable commodity. But with all this uncertainty and with countries clearly seeing, trade being weaponized, um, there is much less incentive for them to hold the dollar as a safe asset. So invariably, what we've seen over the last um, 6 months is investors and debt holders saying, hold on, if the dollar is not going to retain its value, uh, because the US is struggling with a debt problem and you've got tariffs that's probably going to be inflationary. All of this is historically been bad for a currency. You're going to see a weakening of the currency because it also becomes a self-perpetuating a prophecy, in the sense that investors sell their dollars and buy other assets which they now perceive as safe, and gold might be one of those. And they actually sell their dollars, and that just puts more negative pressure on the dollar, apart from already, the inflation and the debt problems.
You've got the slide of US debt to GDP. Tells a story, doesn't that picture?
Yeah, I mean, we've got the debt to GDP of the US there, and you can see that apart from Japan, they're one of the highest debt to GDP numbers. What gives them a bit of leeway is that they generally have got higher economic growth than their peers. So, like for example, a France, a Canada, a United Kingdom, they typically have higher growth, and you can sort of get yourself out of that debt more easily. But the thing that's concerning is they're continuing to run, continuing to make more debt in order to pay interest, and that just means your debt burden will increase. I think what's particularly worrying, if you look at the next slide, where we've got the interest payment as a percentage of revenue. Now, these numbers are estimates. Depending on the source, we're getting a number of somewhere between 18 and 22%. But you can see that the US is actually spending more of their revenue on interest than many emerging markets. We've got Mexico and South Africa up there, as well as China. China hardly spends on their debt, only about 6% of their revenue. But whoever would have thought that the US would be spending more in terms of the interest bill than emerging market countries like Mexico and South Africa? Now, I think just our own circumstances, we're very worried about our own country's debt levels and the ability of our government, to repay its debt. And you actually have the US in arguably a worse position. So, all of this tells us that one should be concerned about the value of the dollar. You should be concerned about inflation, and you should be concerned about US bonds. These things never play out necessarily as one expects, but you can clearly see that in the pricing in the market. You can see the dollar weakening because of these concerns and the ability for the US to continue servicing its debt.
Moving to South Africa, you have pointed out South Africa's high real interest rates, which seem to be quite, why do we have such high real interest rates? You'd imagine that we need a bit of economic growth. Our economy is not exactly performing too well. And doesn't high real interest rate retard economic activity?
That remains an interesting debate in economic circles, Mike. Yes, I mean, if you just look at the chart, we can see we're sitting on the highest real rates in about 20 years. As a reminder, a real rate is the difference between the actual interest rate, or the nominal, to use the economic terms, so the around 7% interest rates that we have at the moment, and the actual inflation rate, for the last 12 months. And that inflation rate is about 3%, slightly below that. So you're sitting on real rates of about 4%, which historically, a country doesn't need that high interest rates in order to attract investment. You can see, for example, in 2018 and 2019, the country had about 2% real rates, which I think many will argue, is sort of a normal rate. But, why are we sitting so high at the moment? We believe, at Current Capital, we believe there's three reasons. Firstly is that inflation in an uncertain environment like we have at the moment, with a lot of commodity prices at massive increases over the last 12 months, remains a concern. So you just sit with this global backdrop of an inflation risk with an uncertain trade policy. Secondly, in South Africa, we've got high administered prices. The electricity increases, municipal increases, and wage negotiations are not subject to the year-on-year fluctuations of other commodities and inflation. But then thirdly, the Reserve Bank has been working on a paper where they're showing that actually South Africa should be lowering its inflation target to about 3%. And the Reserve Bank has made quite a strong view of this recently. They believe actually the target should have been lowered 20 years ago already. There's work out there that shows that we are out of line with the rest of the emerging markets in terms of our inflation target. And on the one hand, the reasoning is sound. They're saying is that if you've got a lower inflation target, you can run lower real rates, and that would be beneficial for economic growth. And then the criticism is immediately, but why don't you cut rates now? Because that will lead to economic growth. And the answer to that is that they believe that a lot of lack of economic growth in South Africa is due to structural reforms. Is that we need structural reforms to get the economy going. A significant cut in rates, they don't believe at the moment will increase economic growth. And I'm not sure if they formally stated that, but that message came very clear if you listen to the governor in his MPC speeches. He would continually refer to the structural reform that's needed in order to grow the economy. So I think the MPC have taken this deal view is that from a economic, well, firstly, the mandate is not to grow the economy. The mandate is to keep inflation under control. And secondly, they're not seeing the structural reform needed that will necessarily change the picture.
Now, that has led to a discussion which is sort of more political than economic about the ownership of the Reserve Bank, where some of our political parties have tackled whether the Reserve Bank, which has got private ownership, but it's got a official mandate. It's not like those shareholders can tell the Reserve Bank what to do. Would it make any difference if the Reserve Bank is owned by the state? And what is it that you think that more of these populist political parties would want to see that Reserve Bank do?
It's fascinating, Mike, that central bank independence is a hot topic across the globe at the moment. President Trump is directly, taking on in social media, taking on his Federal Reserve chairman and believing that interest rates are too high. And I think that's what we've seen historically. I think many politicians, under the belief that economies will prosper on lower interest rates, try and either directly or indirectly pressure central bankers in order to lower interest rates. Similarly, we've seen in history that a strong independent central bank is the cornerstone of a currency. And I think the best example at the moment is Turkey, where they haven't got an independent central bank. There was a significant amount of interference from the president and from politicians, and put in presidents and leaders of the central bank that effectively lowered interest rates when they actually had to be increasing it in order to get inflation under control. So I think that on an economic argument and historical basis, it's pretty clear what a country wants in order for a stable currency and for stable inflation is a truly independent central bank. The exact motive, reasons why politicians might want to interfere with the central bank, that we can only speculate on. But my perception, at least, is that it's often motivated by either an honest or a self-serving belief that the economy will grow. So they can say to their supporters, we will grow the economy. We said there will be more jobs, so we need to lower interest rates to get that done. And that's fine as long as your inflation is under control, but that's rarely the case whenever a central bank becomes under pressure. In terms of our central bank, I think, as you point out, the Reserve Bank can be quite emotional in the South African context, is that we've got this interesting structure where the Reserve Bank is essentially privately owned, but it is almost, for lack of a better word, ceremonial, in the sense that the shareholders have got no influence. They hardly get a benefit out of it. I think there's a nominal dividend distribution which is really a rounding error. And they've got no say in policy. So we're all not always sure whenever there's a call to nationalize the Reserve Bank, if there is what the benefit of that would be, because the shareholders do not have a say in monetary policy. Rather, if there's a change to monetary policy, that has to come from national treasury and that has to come through parliament. So, if South Africans are not happy with how the central bank is being managed, and I'm not for a moment suggesting that they are, the mechanisms are in place. And in fact, we are seeing this now with the reduction, the Reserve Bank themselves proposing and saying, no, hold on, we should be lowering the inflation target for the interest of all South Africans. Now, that's a debate that has to be had at national treasury level. It's a debate that has to be had at parliament. But the correct mechanisms and institutions exist to address this. And yeah, I think we're sometimes a bit baffled about the call to nationalize the Reserve Bank because the shareholders don't have a say on monetary policy.
It sounds like a fun thing. It's like who gets to keep the credit card when you go out drinking. I suppose that's really the issue here.
That's a very apt analogy.
Yeah, and I think some of those political parties are inclined to want the credit card so that they can manage it when we go drinking. You mentioned Donald Trump's war with his central bank. Let's have a quick look at the US real rates. You've got a chart on that, and whether Donald Trump has a point that his central bank is being Federal Reserve, as I call it, is being too snoop with their money. And looking at that chart, what does it tell you?
So, I mean, if you look at the US case, it's very different to South Africa, although ironically, we're sitting also at 20-year highs in terms of the real rates. However, an emerging market, a developed market, especially the country that's the reserve currency, the dollar, have a very different position. They can run much lower real rates and still attract capital to the economy. And that's why you saw that for the majority of the last 15 years, they were actually running negative real rates, as investors of our clients' capital. For a long period, we did not hold US cash or bond assets because, as you can see, you're getting a negative return in terms of inflation. And whenever you're investing, you're looking to get a positive real return for your clients. But that picture has changed. So it's now on the positive side. Is 2% too high for a developed economy? I think the jury is out on that. But what's fascinating about this, for lack of a better word, I mean, when you've got policy being decided on social media, it is, I'm not always sure what's the words to use, but the boo-rah-rah around the central banker, and should he retain his, should Jim Powell remain, chairman of the Federal Reserve, is he's essentially stated that they would have lowered rates if it wasn't for the uncertainty around the tariffs. But as prudent central bankers and as independent central bankers, they now need to assess what the inflation impact of the tariffs will be before they can decide to meaningfully reduce interest rates. If they again go and reduce interest rates when inflation is going up, that puts them in a very difficult predicament. I think you can see the spike downwards there on the chart, where in 2021, 22, the US was running like a minus 8% real rate, which basically just means the interest rate was, let's say, 0.5% or 1%, but the inflation was 9 to 10%. And the big mistake of that era, which I can easily say in hindsight, is that the central bank was way too late to raise interest rates, believing in the so-called transitory story. And now they're in a tough position where if they cut too soon and there is inflation, then you're making the same mistake twice, and that's nearly unforgivable. And if you cut too soon, and if you don't cut, then you really upsetting your president. And that shouldn't matter. It should be an independent central bank, and what the opinion of a politician or even the president of the country is should not matter to a central bank. So I think we're going to see, some interesting environments here. I'm personally wonder if the Trump administration realized that even if they do lower the short-term rates, it's not going to help them on where they need to raise debt, because ultimately when you're borrowing money to the US for 10 years, you're less worried about where the short rate is. You're worried about what money am I going to get for the next 10 years. At least that's what a prudent investor should be doing. And if they cut interest rates too soon, that leads to higher inflation. all you're going to end up is this, that your longer dated bonds will attract a higher interest rate, they will lose value, and it would make it more difficult for your fiscus to balance the books.
It seems to me that Donald Trump's economic style is like sometimes when you go to a braai and you see somebody that starts a fire using petrol. It seems like he wants the whole braai to be run out of the petrol tank, so it may have some impact.
I think what we've seen with the Trump administration, like you say, when somebody shows up to a braai with a tank of petrol, it's best to stand back a bit and see what plays out, before you reach conclusions too quickly. So, and I think that's constantly, even with the tariffs, it's, we've already had a repeal of the tariffs 3 months ago. Let's see what happens in the next 2 weeks.
And of course, that has the one participant in this braai that can't step away is the currency, because currency is traded all the time. You can't say, well, we'll just wait and see. But in the meantime, the rand's had a time, hasn't it? Is the rand strong or is the rand weak?
Always a very emotional and almost loaded question. I think many people might conclude that the rand is, almost unexplainably strong at the moment, because I think most people look at the rand dollar exchange rate, and at the moment it's still below 18. It went as low as 17 rand 50 in the last 2 weeks, and we're still trading below 18 rand. And if you think everything that's happened in the last 3 months and the amount of turmoil there was, most people would have said, we didn't think the rand would actually be stronger than where it started the year. But I think what we might be missing is that we're looking at the rand dollar in isolation. I think once you account for the fact that the dollar has depreciated against other major currencies by about 10% this year, once you take that into account, you get to a different picture. So the one way you can do it is just to say, well, if the dollar was 10% stronger than it is at the moment, then actually we would be quite close to 20 rand against the dollar, which is our historical high against the dollar. Alternatively, you can actually just look at the rand euro exchange rate, and we've got a chart on that as well. I would say over the last 10 years, and you can see, although we're not at that level at 22 against the euro that we had in the so-called Liberation Week, or the week post Liberation Day for the US, when the tariffs was first announced and you had all the market turmoil, we're still trading at a level of 21 to the euro. And I think, as the chart highlights, only about 2 or 3 times in history that we've traded at around 21 against the euro. So once we look at a basket of other hard currencies, you can see that the rand is quite weak at the moment. There is a lot of concern if the GNU will survive. And I think that's one aspect of the reason that the rand is quite weak. And then secondly, the impact of the tariff. So both of those, makes investors more cautious to buy a risk asset, and the rand is considered a risk asset. But the other thing I think also just want to point out, a lot of people will look at this chart and say, but it's one-way traffic. The rand just always weakens. You can see, it was 14 against the euro and it never returned there again. And then it was 16 and it never returned there again. But a chart like this, we like to call mattress rands or mattress euros or mattress dollars. That is what's the value in terms of another currency if you kept your cash under your mattress and received no interest. South Africa runs 4% real rates at the moment, and you're getting, yes, 2% real in the US, but it's still not 4% real. So if you kept your rands in a bank account and you got the interest, you actually ended up with more money over most periods in rands than you would have had in any hard currency. And I think that's an important, that's obviously not applicable for day-to-day trade, for companies trading and buying and exporting. The rand right now is what's important to them. But if you're an investor looking at the long term, you can't just look at the mattress dollars, as I call them, but you have to account for the interest rate, because you're not looking to make an investment for a week. You're looking to make an investment for 5 or 10 years, and the interest rate becomes critical in your calculation. And I think that's where South Africans are benefiting from a high real rate, is that you actually are rewarded for the risk in terms of the interest rates domestically.
Well, Simone, I think we've gone around the world. We've ended up where we are. a bit of an interesting time. We're going to have to monitor things closely, but thank you so much for sharing your insights today. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Wonderful to have you on the State of the Nation business, and we'll do this again. Thank you so much for joining us on this State of the Nation business, and thank you to Corian Capital for sponsoring this segment. Thank you so much. We'll see you again on the State of the Nation business. Thank you so much.